very much. It's a pleasure to be here, even though the topic is kind of a serious topic. I'm going to talk about the link between economics and suicide. I think most people have the perception that economics is unrelated to suicide because suicide is something to do with mental illness, depression, and so forth. And it's not really something for economists to study. But there has been some research in economics, a limited amount, on the topic of suicide. The statistics on suicide just themselves are kind of interesting. If you look at the suicide rates amongst different groups of people in the United States, first, whites in the United States have a much higher rate of suicide than blacks, and also men have a much higher suicide rate than women in the United States. After cancer and heart disease, suicide accounts for more years of lost life than any other cause of death. And I'm going to argue that the economy and economic factors do have a bearing on suicide. There was a paper by Hammermesh and Soth in 1974 Journal of Political Economy that found suicide increased with unemployment and also with income loss in the United States. And so what I thought I would do is I would just get the suicide data for the US and then just get the unemployment data and then just look at it and see if there's a correlation that jumps out at you. And I think given where you're sitting and so forth, this chart's probably difficult to read, but this is the basic data on unemployment in the right-hand column, the overall suicide rate in the second column, and then male and female suicide rates. And you can see that the suicide rate for males is almost 4 times as great as the suicide rate for females in the United States. It's hard in the chart to see a really strong link between the unemployment rate and the suicide rate, but I also put it in a graph. And in the graph, it doesn't look like there's a super close rate, but this green line is the average annual unemployment rate. This red line is the suicide rate amongst females in the US, and the blue line is the suicide rate amongst males in the US. But it looks like the unemployment rate in a very broad sense is high, it drops, and it goes up again. And the suicide rate for females is a little bit elevated relative to where they are in the rest of the chart. It's high, it goes down, and then it goes back up a little bit. So it doesn't look like it's changing very much in response to economic conditions, but at least like kind of the broad long-term pattern might be slightly affected. And then if you look at it for males, and if you start in like the 90s, here's a peak in unemployment. It looks like this is a little dip in the suicide rate, but then unemployment is dropping here, and the suicide rate is dropping, and then unemployment starts going up here, and unemployment starts going up here. So it looks like there's some correspondence between suicide and unemployment just looking at the graph, at least if you start like in the 1990s. Now, it's hard to explain what's happening in the early 80s because unemployment is dropping here and suicide is going up. So it looks like, just looking at the raw data, it looks partially consistent. Of course, Hammermesh and Soth used complicated statistics and much better data than this in finding their relationship between unemployment and the suicide rate. So I want to consider the case of Japan, and the suicide rate in Japan was going up especially for middle-aged men. And Japan is a country where in the period that, that he was considering, the article came out in 2003, in the 1990s, Japan had like a decade-long bad economy. And men in good jobs with large companies, jobs, they call that the primary sector. Men in those primary sector jobs lost their jobs, and it was kind of a shock. I mean, those companies had featured, you know, stable career employment. That was part of their human resource practice. And so when you lost one of those really good jobs, you might never get such a job again. The consequences for the worker were really strong. And so I want to show you the consequences of those job losses. So I have two income streams here. This is the year, how many years you stay with the company. So this is like a tenure earnings profile for workers in this primary sector. Income one, the top profile, is what you make if you continue in employment with your initial employer with the big company in the primary sector. And income two is the earnings profile you get if you lose that job and you have to go and find a new job. And so what you see is that, well, the longer you've been with the company, the more severe is the earning loss that you suffer when you lose your job and you have to go to another job. So according to this, you know, data, I mean, if you look at somebody who's been with their company, say 20 years, it looks like you're losing almost $30,000 when you go to find a new job. Almost a $30,000 loss in income. So if you think about, well, what does that cost you in a lifetime sense? Because it's not just that you have this one-time cost of $30,000 or $40,000. That continues forward in all the additional years until finally you retire at about age 60. So this is what's going to happen. For the workers that are middle-aged and have been with their company for 15 or 20 years, those losses are going to be the biggest because they're giving up a huge amount in earnings when they lose that primary sector job, and yet they also have a good number of years to go before they retire. Of course, for somebody who's been with the company for 30 years, they're giving up so much money, but they're also old and near retirement anyway, so it's not quite as costly. So this is the total loss in earnings, assuming that a person's going to retire at age 60 from losing a job in the primary sector in Japan. And you see that the losses are the biggest for these people in their 40s. Okay, so they're losing almost $200,000 by virtue of losing a primary sector job. And these are people that did get reemployed. It's just that the wages they're offered in reemployment are so much less than what they would have made before. Okay, so, okay, now back to this article from William Pesek. He says it's no coincidence that the suicide rates are growing the fastest among men in their 40s and 50s. This is the group most affected by Japan's restructuring. He said the surge in suicides in Japan closely tracked the decline of the world's second biggest economy. Okay, at the time of this article, Japan had the second biggest economy. Now it's China. In the last decade, suicides increased nearly 70% among men, and it's significant that the biggest increases in self-inflicted death have been among middle-aged men. And I just showed you that's the group that suffered the most from job loss during you know, that tough form recession that Japan was in. Another thing relating to the Japan case is that in Japan, life insurance policies, at this point in time, I don't know if that's changed, but at this point in time, you could still collect on your life insurance policy if you committed suicide. So for some of the men who committed suicide, they decided that their families would be better off without them and without having to you know, be visited by debt collectors, because if they committed suicide, the family would receive a payout from the insurance company. So this kind of points to the suicide having sometimes an economic motive, and also that suicide is affected by the macroeconomy. Okay, now there's another track of research that's relatively recent in economics that relates to suicide, and there's a paper by Dave Marcotte in the Southern Economic Review in 2003, and what he did is he didn't study people who committed suicide. He studied people that attempted suicide. And attempted suicide is much more common than suicide. There are about 20 people that will attempt suicide for every person that commits suicide. And you know, and so he had in his mind an economic model of behavior where people are rational. And it's hard to understand, like, well, how can you be rational and attempt suicide? Or how can you be rational and commit suicide? Well, according to, you know, the model he's considering, you know, it's a model of maximizing happiness, and if things are bad enough, you might be happier if you're dead, according to his model. Okay. And now he didn't study people that had committed suicide because you can't check if they're happier. You don't know them. They're gone. So they can't fill out a survey. But you can do surveys on people that have attempted suicide. And what he finds is that those attempting suicide and surviving report higher incomes than their peers who contemplated suicide but never attempted it. And the more serious the suicide attempt is, the higher the income effect is. He found that there is sometimes an economic motivation for suicide, and he estimated that incomes are 23% higher for those attempting suicide over those who thought about suicide or planned suicide but did not attempt it. Okay. So when you have a serious suicide attempt, all of a sudden people are rushing at you with resources. Your family's so worried about you, the public health system becomes so worried about you, so you're getting attention, you're getting medical resources, you're getting treatment, and your income is rising. That's what he found. So suicide overall has not been the subject of a great deal of economic research. However, the limited research that has been conducted supports the notion that economic variables play a role in suicide. Thank you very much.